All right, hello again. So in this video, we're going to go over CSS Grid, kind of an introduction to CSS Grid, talk about the fundamentals of it, learning the basics, stuff like that. So we'll compare it to other layout methods. We'll talk about some principles and techniques, what it is. We'll try some out. We'll do some. That'll be fun, right? And then do some more experiments and see how it works a little bit. Yeah, so fun, right? I heard you say yes. Okay, so the way this works is there's some information and explanation on the left. There's a bunch of sample code on the right that's kind of commented out, and some instructions and things and different ways to do things. I'm not going to really go over that because it would take a week and a half. But that's kind of the structure. And then at the bottom of each section, we're going to actually make this grid. This is the finished one. Yeah, and then we'll compare it to Flexbox and the normal flow and stuff like that. And then, yeah, do like 3 or 4 grids or something. Sounds fun, right? Okay, so let me get rid of this. So let's talk about how you can use it, or if you can use it. So yes, you can use it. So it is one of the newer specifications in CSS. It's not that new, but it's newer than some of the other ones we'll talk about. But you can see it has pretty good browser support, like 95% browser support. So if your user is using a pretty new or fairly new browser, not IE 11, for example, then you're probably fine. So you are seeing it in the wild more and more. It is very useful, very flexible, very customizable. It's great. It's awesome. So a few more resources and things. So there is the CSS Grid Layout Guide, which is from CSS Tricks. You probably saw the one for Flexbox, probably, right? Which is what everybody goes to look at Flexbox, and it's kind of similar here. It talks about the basics and terminology and properties and things. There's even a poster like there is for Flexbox. If you want to be super nerdy, you could put this on your wall. Probably do it at work. Don't do it at home if you have work. And it goes through the basics and things. So I'll come back to this in a minute and talk about a few different terms and things when we talk about making an actual grid. MDN or Mozilla has a big section on CSS Grid, how to use it, some sample code and things. So that's another resource. And then of course W3 Schools has stuff about Grid, and you can try things out. I think you can try things out. Yeah, try it yourself, and then you can kind of play with it and see what it does. So the usual places you can find information. Okay, so let me get rid of some of this stuff so we have a little clean thing here. So this is our starting page. It might be called something else, but right now I have it called CSS Grid Introduction Start. But I will give you that file hopefully to start with. And it does, like I said, has a bunch of information in it about CSS Grid. So yeah, it's kind of a resource and an exercise, all in one. So I'm going to hide this sidebar here. One more thing before we start is let me make this a tiny bit bigger. Maybe that's too big. That's fine. I did put in a comment that has the general line numbers we're going to edit to do some little bit of experimentation with CSS Grid, kind of do a couple of them. These might change if you put line breaks and things in, or something changes by the time you see this. These might not be exactly right, but they are generally okay at this point anyway. I think that may be big enough. I hope that's big enough for you guys. Okay, so let's take a look at this first table, which is older approaches versus Flexbox and Grid. So it's kind of a little bit out of order, but way back in the pre-Cambrian era, when we were being chased by saber-toothed tigers and stuff, we had table layout. So tables were never designed for layout. They were designed for tables. That makes sense, right? So tabular data, rows and columns of data, was never meant for layout. But as a hack, somebody smart, but also mischievous, figured out that you could use tables to do layout, which means, and when we talk about layout, I should go back and say, when we're talking about layout, we're talking about putting things where you want them to be. We want 2 rows and 3 columns, for example. You want this to be here and that to be there, right? So that's layout, as opposed to just inline normal flow, which goes left to right and top to bottom. What if we want to put something where we want to put it? So that's what layout is, right? So table layout was done for quite a while. It was very kind of messy, and because tables weren't designed for that and involved lots of code. That was way back in the long time ago. Then we had floats. So it's another hack. It is floats, you probably know, you can use for, mainly what it's used for is sort of wrapping text around images and things like that. So it's good for that. You can make text go around an image, for example, so that it's not in a column. But someone figured out that you could use floats to make columns, and then we did that for quite a while. Again, not designed for columns, not really designed for layout beyond wrapping things and things like that. So not great. Then we got positioning. I think that was next. These are a little bit out of order. Sorry about that. Positioning is still around, still used, and tables are still around, and floats are too, but not for full page layouts. But positioning is still used. It's not great for complete page layouts. It is good for pieces of pages like badges, overlays, moving things a little bit, offsetting it, for example, things like that. Some downsides to it, though. It's not great for entire pages. It's not really responsive. You can get overlaps if you're not careful, meaning things are on top of each other, so something can hide something else. It's kind of out of the normal flow of the page a lot of the time, so yeah, it's not used for full page layout, although it used to be more. There were some apps that did it, and you still can use it for that, but it's not the best. So then we got Flexbox. So Flexbox, hopefully you know already. It helps to know Flexbox already before you do CSS Grid. You don't have to, I guess, but it would definitely help. Flexbox is good for one-dimensional layout, meaning rows or columns, horizontal or vertical, right? So it is good for things like nav bars, toolbars, cards that are in a row. The layout of a card sometimes uses Flexbox, or often does. It's really good at alignment and distribution along a single axis. And by axis, I mean horizontal or vertical. But it's not normally thought of as like inherently like 2D, like rows and columns, height and width. It's either height or width often. So it is really good at adjusting space and dividing up space, as opposed to the floats days where we used to say like, make this one 33% wide and make this one 22% wide. So Flexbox figures out a lot of that for you. It is slightly unpredictable because of that, but yeah, it's used a ton, use it, it's great. Now we're talking about CSS Grid. So CSS Grid is two-dimensional, was designed that way. So it does rows and columns. It's good for full page sort of skeletons or scaffolding, dashboards, bento layouts, galleries, all kinds of stuff. You can even do things like have dense packing, so you can do like masonry layouts, and it has subgrid now, which is fairly new, which you can make an interior grid sort of follow the grid lines of the exterior grid. I know that sounds like gibberish, but you'll see something about that later. A lot of the stuff we're not going to cover in this video, but we'll touch on some of it. Downsides, there is more to learn. There's a million ways to do things. It's meant to be very flexible as far as like how you do things. You can, there's a lot of possibilities. So with great possibilities comes great confusion. Is that how that saying goes? No, it could be, right? But to do the basics is actually not very hard, and it works both ways. You can make it complicated, make it very precise, or you can do it in kind of a simple fashion. So the page itself, this page itself uses a bunch of CSS Grid too. So feel free to inspect things and take a look at them. So talking about some principles and techniques. So it's two-dimensional layout. It has rows and columns. You have what's called a grid container and then items inside of it. Kind of like Flexbox, right? With Flexbox, you make a flex container, and then it has its children become flex items. In a grid, it's the parent is the grid container, and then inside of that container are items or grid items. It has lines and tracks, which we'll look at. We'll come back to that in a second. And I'll show you some illustrations on that. It has fractional units, so you can make it sort of flexible or responsive using almost like percentages, but they're fractions of a container, for example. You can use something called named areas, which you'll probably see in a different video, but you can make sort of a bento box layout with different size boxes that kind of overlap. Kind of it's pretty hard to do any other way. I mean, it can be done, But it's very kind of cool how you can do that, and you can kind of lay out the page the way you want it with containers in different sizes and not overlapping, but overlapping rows and columns and things. That's called named areas. You'll see that probably later. And then you can also make pages sort of responsive. So we always usually want to make our pages responsive, meaning they will work on mobile and desktop both, right? Normally that does require, or often does require, media queries, right? You say above this size width, we want to do this, and below it, we want to do that. But using some of the properties in CSS Grid, you can have it become responsive without using media queries, which is pretty cool. So you'll see some of that as we go along. Let me go back to, just for a second, to that CSS Grid layout page. Just wanted to show you a couple of more terms before we start actually doing it here. And some of this is in the file too, but I wanted to show you some of the basics. So here's a grid container. So it's a block element, right? A div. It doesn't have to be a div. It could be a section. Could be any sort of block element. And then that becomes the grid itself. And then inside those becomes the grid items. You have grid lines. And you'll see this too. You can see it in the browser, but I'm going to show you this first. So you have grid lines. Those are the lines between the cells of the grid. They are numbered. You can name them. You have all kinds of possibilities there. Then you have the grid cell. So it does look like a table, right? With rows and columns, but it's not a table, but it acts like one, I guess. You have a grid cell. There's a grid cell. And then a grid track is the rows and the columns themselves. So that's called a grid track. And then a grid area is like I was talking about before. You can make an area, a grid area, and that can contain whatever you want it. And it can be whatever size you want, whatever number of columns and rows you want, all kinds of interesting stuff. Then the rest of this page is broken down similarly to the Flexbox page, where you have grid properties on the left, which are the parent container is the grid container, and then the grid items on the right. And there are a lot of things and a lot of ways, a lot of different semantic, a lot of ways you can mark things up. But take a look at this when you have a question, and it will solve a lot of or answer a lot of your questions. There is a lot, though. I'm not going to lie. I don't know, how long does this page go? Oh man. Okay. Yeah, don't read that whole page. You'll go crazy. Anyway. And there are chapters in your books about it too. All right, so let's get started. So understanding CSS Grid. So it's a two-dimensional layout system for the web, making it rows and columns. It supposedly was the first CSS module created to solve layout problems they've had in 2 dimensions, right? Flexbox is in 1 dimension, but 2 dimensions it's kind of CSS Grid. It's kind of why it was developed. So it's 2-dimensional, like we said. You have control of the gaps or the space between things. That's probably too big. And it's similar to Flexbox in that way. So you'll see that. You can align things. You can position things inside of the grid. It is somewhat responsive depending on how you do things. You can use meaningful layout names if you want, so that makes it easier to understand, which is semantic sort of markup thing. Another way to think of it is you can think of grid as sort of an invisible table-like structure, but it is more powerful, more flexible than an HTML table, and requires less code usually too, much less code. So here's an example, right? We got 2 columns and 2 rows. If I inspect this, I want to show you this before I forget. If I right click on this and inspect it, this actually does use grid for this little example image here. It's not an image, it's actually a grid. And if you're in your, I right click and I inspect, and this works in pretty much any browser, right? If I click on this little button right there that says grid, look at that. I can see the grid lines and the gap and everything else. So here you can see, if I zoom in a little bit, the grid lines are numbered from left to right, 1, 2, 3. And I'm zoomed in the wrong spot. Let's zoom over here. Here's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So since there's 3 columns, there's 4 lines that define the edges of those columns. And that also goes down, right? There's 2 rows, so there's 3 lines, 1, 2, and 3. And then there's the gap in between. Then you can see this is using min-max, which we probably might not get to today, but that is a way to specify, to specify a range of sizes for it, and that's how it becomes responsive. But it's actually telling me how big it actually is too. It's 211 pixels. So lots of information here. And inside of the browser dev tools, which we're looking at, right, you can go in and turn on and off different lines and things to see what's going on. And these are all different grids on this page. There's a bunch of grids on this page, so that's why there's so many options there. But don't forget that's there because it can really help you figure out what's going on with your CSS grid. All right, so these are, and this is 2-column usually when it's wider like that. Maybe I'll make it a little bit smaller. But it's 1 column, so it's responsive to it. It uses grid as well. So this, again, this right side has a bunch of information or sample code that you can think about. I wanted to point this out before we do the first grid here. Is, again, this is the way we kind of used to do it with floats way back in the olden days. I just said olden days. You would say float left and you'd give it a width, and then it would need a clear fix to prevent some weird wrapping stuff. So that was the old way. Then if you want to go one-dimensional, you'd say display flex, and that would create a row or a column, but not both. Although you could have it wrap and it looks like 2 columns, or 2 rows, sorry. And then we've got grid, which is 2D. When you say display grid, that's how you turn something into a grid container as opposed to display flex. And it makes rows and columns. Pretty cool, huh? And then the structure, let me zoom out and zoom in over here a little bit. The structure is you have a grid container, and then all, again, I wanted to say all the children, the direct children, which means they're 1 level down in that grid container, become grid items, and they get placed into the cells of the grid. So basically the key properties that you want to think about are display grid turns it into a grid, and then we're going to use grid template columns to make columns, grid template rows to make rows, and then gap is the space between. Those are the basics. There's lots of other ones, but those are the main sort of important ones that we're talking about. Let me unzoom here. All right, let's make one. Enough talking, right? So we're going to make a basic CSS grid. If we go down and look at this, it is, where is it? It's way down here. There's a lot of code in this. Sorry about that, but a lot of it's just sort of formatting stuff. But if I could find this, it looks like, oh, here it is right here, I think. Demo basic grid. So very simple, right? It's just a div with a class on it, and then each of the items has a class, but really that's just kind of formatting this purple with the white text and stuff. So this is going to be the grid container, is this demo basic grid, and then it's got, what, 6 items inside of it. That's it. So it's fairly simple as far as the markup goes. Let's add the CSS. So again, I did put the line numbers in here. We'll see if that actually works, but I'm going to go down to line 195. Which is a 1 and a 9 and a 5. And it is right here. So it says demo basic grid. So we want to activate the CSS grid layout system. Maybe I will make this a tiny bit bigger to make sure you guys can see it. And I'll move this over. It's going to go to 1 column, but that's okay. Where's my grid? There it is. Okay, so activate the grid system. That sounds like Superman movie or something, but I'm going to say display grid. That was hard, but it didn't really do anything yet, right? Because I haven't given it any columns. So by default, it has 1 column, which looks the same as it did before. So now I want to make, and there are comments in here. So sorry, that makes it a little bit busy in here. That's in the green, right? These are CSS comments, but I wanted to put those in to kind of explain what each line is doing. So it's bit of a trade-off. So now we're going to make 3 columns. So we're going to say grid template columns. And then I'm going to make 3 that are 200 pixels wide. So the way you do that is say 200 px and then a space, 200 px and then a space, 200 px. So now I have 3 columns because however many numbers of numbers, how many values I have in here, that's how many columns there are. So I have 3, right? So if I resize this, it looks like 3 columns, right? That is 3 columns. When I resize here, look. Are you looking? So it's 200, they're each 200 pixels wide. That means there's extra space in here. So they're not really responsive. I set a specific size, which was 200 pixels. So they are. If I inspect it here, and then I go to the grid, click on grid to do that, it's kind of too big. You can see there, they are literally 200 pixels wide because I told them to be 200 pixels wide. So you have a lot of control. You don't have to use hard numbers like that, though. You can make it flexible. So I'm just going to do the same thing, but down one line below, and I'm going to use flexible units instead. So I'm going to say grid template columns again, and this time I'm going to say 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. What does that mean? Those are the fractions that I was talking about. So if you think about it, what's the total number of in here? It's 3. So each one of these is 1/3 of the space. Now they are not 200 pixels wide. They are whatever space there is in there. Each one is going to use 1/3 because there's a total of 3 columns. Pretty cool, right? So now it's responsive, sort of. It's not going to reflow into one column. That's a different technique, but generally that is resizing. Let me refresh here and get rid of those lines on there, even though it's pretty. Why is that doing that? There we go. Okay. You notice I did do the same thing twice here, right? So this is part of the CSS cascade. Since I'm doing the same exact property twice, and this one's second, this one is overriding the first one. So if I were smart, which sometimes I'm not, usually, but sometimes I'm not, I probably would get rid of this because it's confusing to have the same thing twice with different values. But we'll leave it in there just so you can see that you can do that both ways, that way. All right, sorry, I had to adjust something there. So now we're going to make, we have 2 rows, but they are automatically making 2 rows because we have 3 columns and 6 items. So there are implicit and explicit rows and columns. We'll probably talk about that later, but we didn't say how many rows we wanted, so it made 3 because 6 divided by 3 is 2. Yeah. So I did want to show you one more thing though before I do that. If I added one more FR here, what do I get? Oh, I get 4 columns. So however many of these are in there, then I'm going to get that many columns, right? And then the grid items automatically get placed one after the other in those cells. There's actually, if I inspect that again, I know I'm kind of spending too much time inspecting, but there are more cells in there, but there's nothing to go in them, so they're just empty. All right, let's get rid of that because I only wanted 3. All right, so now we want to make a height for our rows. You don't have to do that. The content will do it, but sometimes you will want to do that. So that's up to you. Usually you want to use columns, and then you might want to use rows. Let's put it that way. Depends on what you're doing, right? So I'm going to say grid template rows, which is optional. And then I'm going to say, I want 2 rows that are 80 pixels high. So I'm going to say 80 px and 80 px. So since there's 2, it makes 2 rows. And now they are 80 pixels high. If I put 3 in here, what's going to happen? Let's see. So now there's 3 rows, but there's not enough items to go in there, so it's an empty row. So that just shows you that you can make as many rows as you want. All right, so that's good. So we've got rows and columns in there. We want these right now, these are right up against each other. Then the last thing we're gonna do on this one is add a gap or space. So I'm gonna say gap 10 pixels. And we get a gap of 10 pixels. Look at that, nice, pretty, looks like a table. To make that table would have been a lot more code if you made it as an actual table, which you're not doing anymore. You're not, are you? No, you're not. So that's what gap does, add spacing between the grid items. You can do it one direction and not another, like horizontal and not vertical, but we'll skip that for now. If we want it the same on all sides, you just say gap. The last thing or another thing to remember about gap is it's the same property that's in Flexbox. So they used to have separate properties for spacing between items in Flexbox and grid, if I am remembering correctly, but now they can use the same gap property. So you'll see gap in Flexbox as well. All right, so that was that. So let's go down to the next part here and talk about creating a grid and normal flow versus Flexbox versus grid. So create a grid container by saying display grid. We just did that, Mark. Like, you don't have to say that again. There is an inline grid. We've been saying display grid, or we'll be saying display grid in this video. But there is, I'm gonna make this even bigger so you guys can see it. There is an inline grid. So by default, I mean, normally you're gonna do this display grid and it's full width, which means it takes up all the space in a container. But you can do inline grid and they will stack next to each other. You don't see it a whole lot, but it's possible. So just remember that that's possible. So when you say display grid, a few things happen. The container becomes a grid formatting context, it's called. Just basically becomes a grid container. The direct children become grid items. Items are placed in a single column by default. So when we didn't have any columns, they just stacked up, which doesn't really change that much. So you want to add columns at least, usually. And then you can define your structure a lot of 10,000 different ways. A couple of things to remember. Only direct children become grid items. So grandchildren and deeper elements, those are descendants. I don't think there's a thing called grandchildren. Descendants below the direct children are not affected. So only the one level down from your container becomes a grid item. And then again, if you don't define any columns, they'll be in a single column. So here's a little illustration, right? So normal container, nothing, and we're gonna do this in a minute, so you'll see it. It's just gonna stack vertically, and then you say display grid and give it some columns, you'll get columns. You have to give it columns though for that part to work. In Flexbox, you don't. You can just say display flex and then it goes sideways. There's a bunch of code in here again. Some of it is different ways to do things. So take a look at that when you're sleepy, but you can't fall asleep. You might want to look at that. All right. So what we're going to do is, here we go. What we're going to do is see what it looks like in the normal flow. This is already the normal flow. These are just divs that are stacked. That's what divs do, right? In this container. Then we're going to use Flexbox on this one just to compare it. And then we're going to use grid on this one. So we're going to go down to, let's see, line 273, something like that. Let's go down here. The normal flow is already done. So we're going to go down to, sorry, it's 244 in this case. So it says flex flow. So that's what we want to edit on 244. So that's this guy right here. So right now, this is just the same as this one. It's just stacked up divs. So to create a flex box, hopefully you remember this, you say display flex. And what happened? Oh, we got a flex box. So by default, flex box becomes a horizontal, becomes a single row. And I wanted to put in, let me make this a little bigger so you can see it. I know we got overlap here going on, but I wanted to show you how this second item has more text in it, has more content in it. So Flexbox on its own will try to make things fit in whatever way that it's thinking about using its algorithm brain, right? So this second one is bigger than the rest, but it's just trying to use the content as a cue for that. Oh, that'll work. So here we go. That's after display flex. Now, oh, we're going to use a gap too on this one. I want to show you how you could use gap on both. So I want to say gap 10 pixels. So now there is gap working on Flexbox instead of CSS Grid. So that's the spacing between those elements. All right, so next we want to go down. I think that's it on that one. So now we want to do this one as a CSS Grid and see how it looks different. The code was basically the same for all three of these. The styles are different, right? So we want to go down to grid flow, where it says grid flow. I think it's line 273, which is what I was saying before. And we're going to make that into a CSS grid. There we go. It's this guy right here. And to do that, we've done this a couple times already. We're going to say grid, or sorry, display grid. and nothing happens, right? Because we need to make columns. So I'm going to go down to line 274. And this time I'm going to do a little bit different because we've already done this. I'm going to say grid template columns, and I'm going to use the repeat function, which you'll probably see again in a different video, maybe. But I start typing repeat, and then I get parentheses, and then I'm going to say 3, 1 FR. What does that mean? That is literally the same as saying 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, except it's a little shorter. And you would have less chance for a typo. I don't know. It does basically the same thing in this case, right? It's the same as me saying 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, because it's going to repeat 3 times. It's going to make 1 FR inside of there. So it's kind of a function. So now we'll look at our grid. We've got 3 columns, right? And we've got 4 items. So the first 3 go in the first 3, and item 4 goes into the second row because we didn't say how many rows we wanted. So it made a second row for us. Thank you, CSS Grid. But look at the difference here as well. See, item 2 is longer or bigger in the flex box. In this one, since we said make them all the same size, 1/3, because there's 3 of them, they are all the same size. Doesn't matter what's in them. And sometimes that will, it has to adjust eventually if that doesn't fit, but you'll see that later. All right, so that is 3 columns there. Let's add our gap again. Probably could have skipped it this time, but now we've got our 10 pixel gap in there. The gap is horizontal and vertical here. So there we go. There's the grid flow. Well, that's the grid flow section. That's the CSS grid section here. I think that's it for that. All right, last section. I think this is the last section. Yeah, section 3, grid structure, sizing grid columns and rows. So again, columns and rows are the foundation of your grid. You use grid template columns and grid template rows for that. We talked about grid lines and grid tracks. If I go back here real quick, one more inspection. And click on that. So these are the grid lines again. They go this way, and then they go this way. And then this is a track this way. This is a track. This is a track. This is a track. So the rows and the columns are the tracks. So that's the grid lines and the grid tracks. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but the grid line numbers, they have numbers, but you can also name them, which you won't see in this video, but maybe a different one. But they have numbers, 1, 2, 3, and 4. They also, you could name them backwards. So I could say I want something to end at line negative or grid line -1, which is right there. That will always be the last grid line, for example. So you can say negative goes right to left, positive goes left to right. Same on the rows. Here's 1, 2, and 3. And I'm not seeing the other one, but I think they're in there somewhere. But it does go both directions. Okay, that's enough of that. Okay, so we talked about grid lines and grid tracks. I just talked about how they're numbered, and they can also reverse from the last line, be -1. So your sizing options for columns and rows are varied. You have a lot of different options as far as units go. You can use a fixed number like 200 pixels. You could use a flexible fraction like the FR unit, which is used a lot. You can make it content-based. You could say auto, which I think is the default. You can use percentages if you want, like you can with other things. And you can use min and max with limits. So we're not really using min max on this one. We probably will use it in a different video. But what this means is I want to make a column that is at least 100 pixels wide. That's the min. But the max is 1 FR, which would be full width or 100%. So that's how you can make it be responsive, right? I want it to get smaller down to 100 pixels, but that's as small as it gets. Or bigger, it gets as big as the container. So it makes it responsive. So here's another grid example, but we're going to go down, skip down here, and actually make one kind of like that, this last grid here. So I think this is on line 300 approximately. Here it is, section 3, rows and columns. Yeah, there we go. So demo, rows and columns. So enable the grid layout. Do you guys remember how to do that? I think you do. You say display grid. Now nothing happens because we don't have any columns, right? So now I'm going to make some columns. Let's make uneven columns this time though. So we're gonna say grid template columns, and we're gonna do 1FR, 2FR, 1FR. What does that mean? So it kind of says it in there. I think this is all right. So now we have 4 total units, right? 1 plus 2 is 3 plus 1 is 4. The middle one is twice as big as the other 2. So it's half the width of everything, right? So now if you look at this grid, or this, this grid, this one is twice as wide as these two, because these are 1FR on the outside. This one in the middle is 2FR. What if I did 2FR right here? Now, well, it's doing some weird stuff. I shouldn't have done that. Oh, I put a 5, that's why. 2FR. These are both the same width, even though it says 1FR. I put 2FR on it. This is 2, this is 2, and this is 1. So you can mix and match the units there, or the amounts. I put that back to 1FR, 2FR, and 1FR. So 1 is going to be narrow, and then wide, and then narrow again. All right, so let's do different heights on the rows too. I'm going to say grid template rows. And you see it is popping up with some different options in there inside of VS Code, but we're typing this stuff in so we can kind of look at it. I want to make the first one 60 pixels high, the second one 80, and the last one is auto. So which is the default? I think it probably won't change anything, but let's do 60 pixels, 80 pixels, and then auto. All right, and then let's add our gap right away because we can't really tell what's going on yet. Let's do a gap of a smaller gap. Let's do 8 pixels, just for fun. Doesn't have to be 10 all the time. All right, so now we've got 3 columns, 1FR, 2FR, and 1FR. We've got 3 rows, 60 pixels, 80 pixels, and then auto, which is using the height of the content in this case. I think that is the default, is auto. Pretty cool, huh? So you can do pretty elaborate types of sizing of these elements, and there's more ways to do this too when we haven't gotten to min-max and all that kind of stuff. But that does show you that you can kind of move things around and space things the way you want it. So hopefully that was okay. You guys got an idea about how CSS Grid works. We will do more of this. It has a lot of different potential and ways to do things and different things you can do with it. But I hope that helped a little bit, and I will talk to you again later.